Have you ever wondered how close someone can get to pulling off the perfect crime? Not the kind you see in cheap thrillers, but the kind that feels like it was designed by an artist, precise, calculated, flawless. Imagine three men walking through the quiet halls of a museum long after midnight. No alarms, no guards, no mistakes. Just the echo of their steps against marble floors and the hum of security systems they've already silenced. Every move rehearsed, every second measured. For months, they've lived and breathed one mission: to take what no one else dared to touch. They weren't reckless criminals chasing a quick fortune. They were professionals, experts who studied the patterns of the guards, memorized camera rotations, and even replicated the museum's corridors inside an abandoned warehouse to practice the heist again and again. To them, this wasn't just a robbery. It was an act of perfection, a performance that would prove they were smarter than the system built to stop them. And for a while, it seemed they were right. From the moment they stepped inside, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Their fake employee badges fooled the security scanners. Their gloves left no trace. The paintings they took were chosen not only for their value but for the precision with which they could be removed. No damage, no sound, no sign of forced entry. The guards on duty never even looked in their direction. It was as if they didn't exist. But here's the question that changes everything. How can a plan that seems perfect collapse because of something so small that no one even thought to check? What if the detail that destroys months of planning isn't inside the vault, but just above the door they plan to escape through? The smallest oversight, one that should have been impossible, becomes the silent witness to everything they did. The truth is, the line between genius and disaster is thinner than anyone wants to admit. One forgotten update, one new piece of equipment installed without their knowledge, one decision to trust information that was a week too old. That's all it takes. The kind of detail you'd never notice unless it was pointing directly at your face. You see, that's what makes stories like this so haunting. They remind us that even when we think we're in control, reality has a way of humbling us. It's not just about the crime, it's about the illusion of mastery. These men believed they could outsmart every system, every guard, every variable. And maybe for a few hours they did. But perfection has a weakness. It blinds you to the fact that the world keeps changing, even while you're busy believing it won't. The night of the heist wasn't just a test of skill. It was a test of fate. Every second they moved through the darkness, they believed they were invisible. Every breath they took was heavy with triumph. They had done it, or so they thought. The museum's alarms stayed silent. The city slept, and the stolen masterpieces disappeared into the night. But what they didn't know, what no one had told them, was that a single camera, newly installed above the emergency exit, was quietly recording everything. Not faces, not full identities, just a glimpse, a fraction of a second showing part of a hood, the edge of a neck, and the curve of a jaw. Insignificant to anyone else, but not to the technology designed to recognize even the smallest fragment of a human face. What happens next will prove just how fragile perfect really is. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to see isn't just about a failed heist. It's about how arrogance, time, and one forgotten update can turn brilliance into ruin. Now, let's step inside the museum, into the silence before everything begins to fall apart. The museum had a reputation that made even the boldest thieves hesitate. It wasn't just a building. It was a fortress wrapped in marble and silence. Inside, some of the world's most priceless works of art hung under dim, deliberate lighting, the kind that made every brushstroke look sacred. Each piece carried a story. Each corner was monitored. Each corridor had its own rhythm of footsteps and distant whispers from the night guards. To most, this was a place of culture. To the three men preparing to break in, it was a masterpiece waiting to be rewritten. The Rothwell Museum of Fine Arts sat at the heart of the city like a monument to untouchable beauty. Years earlier, it had been the scene of multiple failed attempts. Amateurs who underestimated its security, professionals who almost made it but vanished into prison cells before tasting freedom. Every failure was documented, every weakness reinforced, every mistake studied and sealed. The museum learned from its enemies, evolving like a living organism, which meant that anyone trying to beat it would have to become something even smarter. That's exactly what made this new trio different. They didn't approach the Rothwell like criminals. They approached it like engineers of perfection. For them, the challenge wasn't stealing the art, it was proving that they could outthink the system itself. They spent weeks inside as visitors, memorizing the guard rotations disguised as ordinary tourists. They attended charity galas, took photos, smiled for the cameras, and quietly mapped every hidden angle in their minds. No detail was too small. Where the guards rested, where the air vents echoed, even the seconds it took for the motion sensors to reset after each patrol. And yet, beneath all that brilliance, there was one invisible flaw, the assumption that the building would stay exactly the same. The team worked off old schematics downloaded months before. Their insider source, a former maintenance supervisor, had given them everything they needed: blueprints, access codes, patterns. But he had no idea that after his dismissal, the museum had begun a silent round of upgrades. New cameras, new sensors, a few minor changes that no one had documented online. Still, in their minds, the Rothwell was an open puzzle. They rehearsed every move inside an abandoned textile warehouse on the outskirts of town. They recreated the security desk, the laser grids, even the hum of the temperature control system that kept the paintings alive. When the ex-curator, the oldest of the three, walked them through each scenario, he'd repeat the same line like a mantra: "Art deserves precision." And they all nodded, because this wasn't just about money. It was about pride, about leaving their signature on the greatest theft the city had ever known. By the end of their preparations, they had solved every variable. The timing, the entry, the exit, every sequence choreographed like a symphony. They even memorized which guard would take a smoke break and how many minutes the external patrol would take to circle back. They believed they had found every weakness, every blind spot, every one but one, because a week before the heist, in the name of routine security modernization, a small dome camera was quietly mounted above the emergency exit. No press release, no announcement, not even a note in the internal system. Just a single lens, fixed on the door no one thought mattered. It was invisible to them, the kind of detail that only destiny seems to remember. As the night approached, the museum stood like it always did, silent, perfect, unbreakable. And somewhere in that stillness, the new camera blinked for the first time. Stay with me, because what happens next will turn the most elegant crime into a masterpiece of failure. They weren't amateurs chasing luck. They were architects of deception. Each of the three had a specific purpose, a defined role in a puzzle that required absolute precision. Elias Ward, the mastermind, was a former curator who once handled the very pieces they were now planning to steal. He knew the paintings like old friends, their frames, their alarms, the specific screws that held them in place. Then there was Marco Vega, the tech expert, a quiet man whose talent was disarming security systems faster than most people could unlock a phone. Finally, Jonas Red, the one who could pass for anyone. With his calm voice and practiced smile, he'd spent weeks blending in among staff, borrowing the language and posture of those who worked behind the scenes of art and silence. Together, they formed what Elias called the Invisible Trio. Every step of their plan had been drawn out on worn sheets of paper, edges smudged with coffee and graphite. They studied movement like choreography. The camera's rotations were memorized to the second. Jonas had even learned the rhythm of the night guard's footsteps. 40 paces between each turn, 3 seconds to glance down at their flashlight, 5 seconds before they looked up again. The brilliance of their plan was its simplicity. They wouldn't break in, they'd walk in. Using falsified employee credentials and an internal access schedule stolen from a maintenance supervisor's laptop, they'd arrive just before dawn during the staff shift change, when confusion was routine. They would wear the same uniforms, carry the same tools, speak in the same tone. No alarms would sound, no eyes would question them. It was the kind of precision that only obsession can create. But there's a thin line between confidence and blindness. Elias believed his years in the museum gave him complete knowledge of its systems. What he didn't consider was that time had moved on. Technology had evolved. The world outside their blueprint didn't stop updating itself just because their plan was flawless on paper. The trio met every night in a rented storage room lit by a single bulb. They practiced over and over until the silence between them felt heavier than words. Each knew that once they stepped inside, there would be no improvisation, no second chances. And yet, amid all the perfection, a certain pride began to take shape. Subtle, intoxicating, dangerous. Elias started speaking about the heist not as a job, but as a legacy. People will study this, he told them. They'll call it art. He didn't know how right he was, just not in the way he imagined. Tell me something. If you were planning the perfect heist, what's the one mistake you think you'd never make? They treated the rehearsal like a performance, rehearsing until muscle memory replaced thought. In the back of an abandoned textile warehouse, they had recreated a sliver of the Rothwell, a mock security desk, taped outlines of display cases, a crude replica of the emergency exit. Under the single buzzing bulb, they ran through the plan again and again until every motion read like a line in a play. Timing was everything. The pause at the scanner, the silent removal of a frame, the careful sliding of the painting into a protective sleeve. Their drills were not reckless improvisations. They were rituals. Marco rigged a portable console that mimicked the museum's control panel. He practiced bypassing motion sensors and replaying camera feeds until the sequence felt automatic. Jonas practiced the mannerisms of staff. How to carry a clipboard, how to nod without making eye contact, how to answer questions with a calm, routine voice. Elias walked them through the physical steps of removing a masterpiece without leaving microscratches, how to handle humidity-sensitive canvases, the specific screws that house tamper sensors. They timed every second with a stopwatch, iterating the plan until it fit perfectly into the narrow window between patrols. They simulated problems too. What if a guard lingered 5 seconds longer? What if a tour group delayed the shift change? They built contingencies like an architect drafts backup supports. If an alarm tripped, Marco had scripts to freeze the feed. If someone came down the corridor, Jonas had an excuse rehearsed to present on the fly. The rehearsals hardened their confidence. They began to speak of contingencies as mere footnotes. Perfection, they believed, could be rehearsed into inevitability. But rehearsals happen in controlled spaces, and the real world refuses to be perfectly controlled. The warehouse could not replicate the slight echo in the Rothwell's West Wing. The way heat from the HVAC shifted a sensor's sensitivity by an inch, the tiny environmental variations that make identical actions feel different depending on where they're performed. They could practice the movement of a guard on a wooden floor, but not the subtle pause when a guard checks a display that contains his favorite painting. Those small deviations are the kind that quietly rearrange the outcome of a night. Yet, in the days before the heist, their rehearsals produced a dangerous entitlement. They started to trade jokes about how famous they'd be, about how critics would debate whether the theft itself was a work of art. Elias's voice grew softer when he spoke about legacy. Jonas laughed a little too easily at risks. Confidence crept into their edges until it masked caution. At the end of one long night of practice, as they packed their tools into duffel bags, Marco said, almost to himself, "We've fixed everything." Elias smiled and nodded, and Jonas tightened his gloves as if that final mechanical motion could seal fate. Quick poll. Tell me in the comments. What would you rehearse the most if you had to pull off a flawless plan? The night came wrapped in an ordinary silence that almost felt like complicity. City lights dimmed, taxis thinned out, and the Rothwell's stone face reflected the moon in dull silver. They arrived separately, each under the guise they had practiced 100 times. Elias in a maintenance jacket with a clipboard, Marco carrying a black equipment case that looked exactly like the ones used by contractors, and Jonas sliding through the staff gate with the ease of someone who had spent weeks pretending to belong. The air smelled like rain and old varnish. The museum smelled like history and locked secrets. Inside, everything moved like a well-oiled machine. Marco's fingers worked in a calm, practiced rhythm as he connected his portable console to the utility panel they had scoped weeks before. The control room's feed blinked, then stilled, showing a frozen stream of dark hallways and the predictable sweep of a patrolling guard. Exactly what they needed. Jonas walked through the east wing with the gait of someone who knew which displays to avoid and which ones to cross under without drawing attention. Elias, steady as a conductor, moved toward the gallery that housed their target pieces, his mind replaying the steps he had taught them in the warehouse. The theft itself was a choreography of silence. The painting they chose came away from its mount with the precision of a practiced hand. Its protective casing slipped over it like a glove. No alarm stripped. No unexpected footsteps echoed. For a time, minutes that felt like stolen eternity, the plan unfolded exactly as they had imagined. They threaded the paintings through service corridors, past climate controls, and into the narrow corridor leading to the emergency exit. Outside, the city slept. Inside, their pulse was the only thing louder than velvet. What made the night so convincing was the confidence that lived inside every small action. They were not just executing a plan. They were performing a role they had rehearsed into the marrow. There was a sacredness to how Elias handled the canvases, a reverence that bordered on obsession. Marco's eyes flicked between feeds and readouts with clinical calm. Jonas, who had never once flinched in practice, kept his face a mask of routine professionalism. Then, at the final step, as they moved toward the exit they had examined 100 times on paper and in the warehouse, their world narrowed to the thin seam of the door and the path beyond it. The emergency exit they'd chosen was supposed to be the last clean stroke of their masterpiece, the quiet point of departure into a new life. They pushed the door, slid the paintings through the gap, and stepped into the stairwell that would lead them to the outside alley and their waiting van. For a handful of seconds, perfection held. Quick thought, drop a comment. If you were standing where they stood at that exact moment, would you feel unstoppable or terrified? The new camera had been installed only a week earlier, an upgrade buried inside a maintenance report that no one outside the security department had even read. It wasn't meant to be special. Just another lens in a long list of silent witnesses scattered across the Rothwell ceilings and corners. But fate hides in small things, and this one hung quietly above the emergency exit, angled just slightly downward, its red indicator light deliberately disabled so no one would notice it glimmer in the dark. When the trio slipped through that door, they didn't see it. Their attention was fixed on the van waiting down the alley, on the weight of the paintings in their gloved hands, on the heavy breath of triumph that comes right before escape. For months, they had memorized every visible camera in the museum. Marco had even listed them by model and serial number. But this one was different, new, unfamiliar, invisible to their maps. Its lens caught only fragments. The edge of Elias's hood, the slope of his neck, and a narrow triangle of exposed skin that reflected the emergency light for less than a second. It wasn't enough for a human eye to identify, but it was all that the recognition software needed. First, no one noticed. The alarm stayed silent, the exit closed behind them, and the night swallowed their footsteps. They loaded the van, wrapped the paintings, and drove into the city's empty streets with the satisfaction of men who had beaten the system. The Rothwell would wake up hours later to absence, to empty frames, faint traces of movement in the dust, and a void in the heart of its galleries. News would break before sunrise. Commentators would marvel at the audacity. Experts would whisper about a ghost team. For a few days, it looked like they had done it. But inside the museum's security hub, a quiet review was already underway. Routine, standard procedure after every night shift. One officer watching playback on fast forward. The man wasn't even looking for anomalies. He was checking timestamps. That's when he saw a brief shimmer of motion in the far corner of the screen. A tiny flare of light at the emergency exit. He froze the frame, reversed it, and zoomed in. A shape, a hood, a jawline. He hesitated, not sure what he was seeing. But the museum's system wasn't designed for hesitation. The software automatically flagged the image, sent it to the city's central database, and cross-referenced every known profile within 20 miles. The algorithm didn't take long. Facial recognition doesn't need a full face. A few points, a few curves, a piece of the neck where an old scar ran from jaw to collarbone, that was enough. Within hours, the system had matched the pattern to Elias Ward, former curator, dismissed years earlier under quiet suspicion of insurance fraud. The police didn't announce anything publicly. They waited, watching movement patterns, reviewing recent phone signals near the museum, tracing vehicle registrations that matched the type of van caught faintly on a nearby traffic camera. Elias had no idea. Neither did Marco or Jonas. For them, The days that followed were filled with silence and disbelief that everything had gone as perfectly as planned. They divided the paintings for storage, arranged coded messages for potential buyers, and promised each other they'd wait until things cooled down. Their only mistake now, they thought, would be acting too soon. But the image kept circling, shared quietly between departments, enhanced frame by frame, cross-checked against surveillance from neighboring streets. Each pass made the blur sharper, the outline more distinct. And the longer it circulated, the tighter the net became. Sometimes downfall doesn't announce itself with alarms or sirens. Sometimes it begins with a single click on a paused frame, with a technician leaning closer to a screen in the early hours of morning. One frame led to one match led to one name, and a name is all the police ever need. In another part of the city, as Elias walked into his apartment and turned on the lights, unaware that his own reflection was already being studied in 100 digital reconstructions, the small red LED of a nearby surveillance camera blinked. It wasn't the same one that caught him, but it might as well have been. Every camera now was his shadow. The perfect crime had already started to unravel, quietly, invisibly. From a corner of the museum, no one had thought to look at twice. By morning, the Rothwell Museum was a crime scene wrapped in quiet disbelief. Detectives walked the empty corridors as if afraid to disturb the silence left behind. The missing paintings were worth more than $10 million combined, but that wasn't what unsettled the investigators. It was the precision. No broken locks, no tripped alarms, no fingerprints. Whoever had done this knew the place better than its own security staff. The headlines were immediate. Flawless art heist stuns city. Reporters called it a ghost operation. Experts on television speculated about elite international syndicates. The police commissioner, standing before cameras that afternoon, admitted they had no solid leads. Behind the scenes, though, the reality was different. The image from that unnoticed camera had already been enhanced, filtered, and sharpened. Artificial intelligence had outlined contours invisible to the naked eye. The jawline matched. The scar matched. The statistical certainty blinked on screen. 98.7%. Detective Rowan, who led the investigation, had seen hundreds of crimes crumble because of arrogance. But this one fascinated him. He printed the still image on matte paper, pinning it beside others, past arrests, security angles, license plates. "This man thought he was invisible," he murmured. "They always do." The hunt began not with a siren but with a soft hum of computers analyzing patterns. The first break came from traffic footage near the River District. A gray van, license plate partially obscured by mud, passed beneath a streetlight exactly 4 minutes after the museum's alarm system froze. The timestamp aligned perfectly. Analysts enhanced the image until the shape of Marco's shoulder matched the same proportions from an older ID photo tied to a different name. One match became two. Jonas was harder to find. He lived like a ghost, no fixed address, always moving between low-rent motels. But ghosts leave traces too. A coffee purchase, a security door log, a phone ping that stayed active 5 seconds longer than it should have. By the second day, the trio had gone from unknowns to targets. Unaware of how close the walls were closing in, Elias sat in his apartment surrounded by the paintings, wrapped, untouched, leaning like sleeping giants against the wall. He told himself he would wait a month before moving them. But silence breeds noise in the mind. Every knock at the door, every passing siren, began to sound personal. Jonas noticed it first. A car parked too long near the storage unit. He mentioned it once, casually, but Elias dismissed it. "They have nothing," he said. "We left no trace." Marco wanted to check the news, but Elias forbade it. "We don't look back," he insisted. Yet even as he spoke, a small detail gnawed at him. That last glance toward the exit, the faint glimmer he thought he'd imagined above the door. It had been so brief he hadn't told the others. He convinced himself it was nothing. On the third night, as rain fell in fine needles against the windows, the first arrest came quietly. Jonas, stepping out of his motel for cigarettes, saw flashing blue in the puddles before he heard the command. He didn't run. Perhaps he knew it was useless, or perhaps he finally understood that no performance lasts forever. Within hours, Marco followed. The police had traced the equipment supplier who sold him specialized bypass modules. His hands, the same ones that had moved with machine-like precision in the museum, now shook as they were cuffed. Elias watched both arrests on the news he swore he wouldn't watch. The reporter called it the unraveling of perfection. He stared at the screen, eyes fixed not on the footage of his partners being led away, but on the image behind the reporter, a frozen frame from the security footage. A hood, a jaw, a thin scar that caught the light. His scar. The one detail that had lived with him for years and betrayed him in seconds. Perfection, he thought, had a face after all, and it was his own. Elias didn't sleep for the next 48 hours. The soft ticking of the clock in his apartment became unbearable, as if every second was mocking the time he thought he'd stolen. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. People heading to work, lights changing, traffic humming. But for him, everything felt suspended in the moment between exposure and collapse. He tried to tell himself that it wasn't over, that the footage couldn't possibly be enough. A blur, a fragment. But denial is a fragile wall when reality is already pushing through the cracks. He went through the motions of survival with the same precision that had once defined his heist. He switched phones, changed safe houses, even altered his walking routes. Yet, with every attempt to regain control, the same realization gnawed deeper. His perfect plan had already begun to disintegrate the night they escaped the museum. The mistake wasn't the camera. It was believing that the world could ever be completely known. Marco and Jonas were in custody by then. The news replayed their arrests over and over, each channel turning the story into a spectacle. Phrases like flawless execution undone by a single detail looped across the bottom of the screen. Elias watched the footage of Marco's apartment being raided, the tech equipment stacked neatly on the table, photographed under sterile lights. Then Jonas, head down, face hidden beneath his hood, being led into an unmarked car. Elias noticed the way Jonas's hands trembled. He'd never seen that man afraid before. That image stayed with him longer than he expected. When the police came for him, it wasn't with the noise he imagined. No crashing through doors, no shouted commands. Just two quiet knocks. When he opened the door, Detective Rowan stood there holding a single folder. Inside, printed on glossy paper, was the frame, the hood, the scar, the faint reflection on his neck. "You built a flawless plan," Rowan said. "But perfection doesn't exist, Mr. Ward. It just waits for a camera angle you didn't account for." At the station, the interrogations were almost polite. Elias spoke little. He answered questions about logistics, not emotion. He didn't ask about Marco or Jonas. He didn't ask about the paintings. The officers noticed how calm he seemed, almost relieved. When the district attorney offered a plea deal, he refused to sign. The prosecutor asked him why, and he simply replied, "Because it was perfect until the end. I'd rather it stay that way." The paintings were recovered days later in a storage unit under Elias's name. A final irony that didn't surprise anyone. They were undamaged, preserved with care, returned to the museum as if nothing had ever happened. Reporters called it poetic. The thieves who treated art with reverence only to destroy themselves with pride. Rowan didn't see poetry. He saw predictability. "Every flawless crime is just a clock," he told a colleague. "It starts ticking the moment they believe it won't." Months passed. The trial came and went. Marco cooperated for a lighter sentence. Jonas pleaded guilty and asked for no leniency. Elias remained silent through it all. When the verdict was read, 20 years without parole, he looked at the judge with the same calm he had on the night of the heist. There was no protest, no sign of defeat, only acceptance. Maybe, in his mind, this ending was part of the art itself. The Rothwell reopened with new security systems, more cameras, more guards. A small plaque near the recovered paintings read, "Returned after the 2024 incident, recovered untouched." Visitors paused there, unaware of the human cost behind those words. The city moved on, the story became legend, and Elias faded into a number on a prison ledger. Yet, sometimes, late at night, guards walking the museum's halls swear they can hear faint echoes, footsteps where there should be none, the creak of a door that never opens. Maybe it's just the old building settling. Or maybe perfection leaves behind a shadow that refuses to disappear. If you've made it this far, tell me in the comments. Do you think perfection really exists? Or is every masterpiece destined to crack somewhere in the dark? There's something almost sacred about the silence that follows a downfall. It's not loud, not violent. It settles like dust after a long storm. Quiet, patient, inescapable. For Elias Ward, that silence became his entire world. Years after the trial, long after the cameras stopped flashing and the city forgot his name, the memory of that night at the Rothwell Museum lived on in the rhythm of his days. The sound of the cell door closing each morning echoed like the hiss of the vault sealing shut behind him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had wanted to be remembered as the man who outsmarted the system, but what remained was something far more fragile. A cautionary tale about what happens when precision blinds itself to humility. He spent his first months in prison replaying every second of the heist. Not as guilt, not even as regret, but as analysis. He dissected the timeline, every frame, every decision. He thought about the camera, how easily he could have noticed it if he'd just looked an inch higher, if he'd listened to the small voice that warned him something had changed. But perfection doesn't allow for self-doubt. That's its hidden flaw. The moment you start believing you've accounted for everything, you stop looking for what you've missed. In time, the city's fascination with the Rothwell case faded into another headline lost to memory. The paintings drew more visitors after their return than they ever had before. People came not just to see the art but to stand where it had once vanished, to whisper about the thieves who had touched history and paid the price for it. Guides spoke of the heist with a mix of awe and warning, turning Elias and his partners into myths. And myths, once born, don't die, they just shift into new meanings. Elias became a ghost that haunted not the museum, but the idea of perfection itself. Among collectors and curators, his name turned into a shorthand for arrogance. Don't pull a Ward, they'd say when someone underestimated a risk. Even inside prison, his legend persisted. Guards treated him with a strange mix of respect and caution. Some inmates asked him how he'd done it, how he'd bypassed so many layers of security. He never answered. He'd simply stare at the wall for a while before saying softly, "We didn't fail that night. We failed long before it." Because that's the truth most people missed. The heist didn't collapse because of a camera. Collapsed because of certainty. The belief that preparation replaces awareness. The arrogance of thinking that systems are static while the world is constantly moving. Technology evolves, protocols shift, and even the smallest updates can undo a masterpiece of planning. But deeper than that, perfection collapses under the weight of human nature itself. Pride disguises itself as logic. Confidence masquerades as control. And once those illusions settle in, even the brightest mind becomes blind to the simplest truths. The Rothwell heist became a lesson not just in crime, but in the psychology of ambition. In universities, criminology students studied it as an example of cognitive closure, the phenomenon where people stop seeking new information once their theory feels complete. In leadership seminars, speakers used it to talk about overconfidence, about how unchecked expertise can turn into its own weakness. In every retelling, the theme was the same. No plan, no mind, no structure is truly perfect. Perfection is the moment before the fall, the breath you take before realizing you've stepped off the edge. Years later, Detective Rowan retired. On his last day, he opened a file drawer marked Rothwell case and found the printed still frame, the hood, the neck, the scar. He held it in his hands for a long time, staring at the captured fragment that had toppled so much brilliance. He didn't feel triumph, not anymore, just an odd kind of empathy. Rowan had spent decades chasing criminals, but few ever fascinated him like Elias. Not because of the theft, but because of what it revealed, that genius and downfall are often the same thing seen from two different angles. He placed the photo back in its folder, locked the drawer, and said to himself, "Perfection doesn't last. It just pretends to." And in another part of the city, inside a narrow prison cell where dawn painted the concrete with pale light, Elias Ward traced a faint line on the wall with his finger, the same motion he once used to outline frames in the museum. He closed his eyes, hearing the faint hum of electricity above him, imagining it as the sound of a security feed looping endlessly, recording a moment that could never be undone. Somewhere, in that hum, he thought he could still hear the whisper of the past. The door creaking open, the camera blinking awake, the breath before discovery. It wasn't the theft he remembered most, but that final instant when he believed they had escaped. The feeling of completion, the illusion of control, the split second before the unseen lens captured what they had all refused to see. That no matter how careful the plan, how flawless the design, perfection dies the moment you believe in it. In the end, the Rothwell heist stopped being a story about stolen paintings. It became a story about people, about how brilliance, when left unchecked, turns on itself. What began as an act of precision ended as a quiet tragedy of human blindness. The headlines faded, the courtrooms emptied, and the world moved on. But somewhere in that silence, the echo of that single mistake, a camera above an unremarkable door, still lingers like a heartbeat that refuses to stop. For every perfect plan ever made, there's a flaw waiting in the shadows. For every mind convinced of its genius, there's a detail it will never see. That's what makes these stories so haunting. They remind us that control is an illusion, that fate doesn't announce itself, and that perfection is often nothing more than arrogance wearing a calm face. Elias Ward and his team didn't just steal paintings. They stole a moment of belief from the world, the idea that human design could ever outsmart chance. Today, the Rothwell stands stronger than ever. New walls, new cameras, new layers of security, each one built on the ruins of their failure. Tourists wander through its corridors, pausing before the recovered paintings, reading the small plaque that mentions the 2024 incident. They'll never feel the pulse that once beat through those halls, never sense the invisible weight of that night. But if you look closely enough, if you let your eyes wander to the ceiling, above the emergency exit, you might see the faint reflection of a camera lens still watching, still remembering. The story of the perfect crimes gone wrong isn't about justice or punishment. It's about inevitability. The universe doesn't punish arrogance. It simply waits for it to reveal itself. Elias learned that too late, and perhaps that's why his silence became his confession. In his own way, he achieved immortality, not as a thief but as a warning. His name may fade, but the lesson remains etched in the fabric of every plan, every illusion of control, every whisper that begins with the words, "This time, nothing can go wrong." Maybe that's the real legacy of the Rothwell heist, a reminder that even when everything seems under control, life is always one unseen angle away from rewriting the script. If you've stayed with me until now, you already know what kind of stories we tell here, not about victory, but about the fragile truth behind human ambition. So if you want to keep exploring the crimes that almost worked, the plans that fell apart in the smallest, most unexpected ways, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the next story might start just like this one, with someone who thought they'd found perfection, right before the moment it disappeared.